Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Daniel Bryant, News Manager at InfoQ and Product Architect at DataWire, and I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Marty Abbott and Tanya Cordrey. Marty is the CEO and co-founder of AKF Partners, a global technology consulting organisation, and Tanya is a partner at AKF Partners. Marty and Tanya have both had fascinating careers and worked together in the early days of eBay. I've followed Marty's work for many years now, having been a big fan of the books he co-authored, The Art of Scalability and Scalability Rules, and so I was keen to learn more about his latest thinking in regard to the models that he and the AKF team have been working on. If you look back through my talks online, you can see that I've referenced the AKF Scale Cube a lot in relation to microservices. I've also followed Tanya's work for quite some time, and I wanted to explore her experiences in relation to when she worked as the Chief Digital Officer at Guardian News and Media. Tanya was on the senior executive team here as the organisation scaled from national news reporting to a global presence. I knew Tanya had a lot of great insights into leading teams, setting objectives and sharing the vision, and this is an area I wanted to focus on and dive a little deeper into. Hello Tanya, hello Marty, and welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Hello Daniel.
Hi.
Could you briefly introduce yourselves for the listeners please and share a bit of your background or career highlights as well, thanks.
Okay, I'll start. So I'm Tanya Cordrey. I previously led the Guardian's global engineering product and data teams. It was a great time to be at the Guardian because during that period, the Guardian transformed from a UK and print-centric organisation to a global digital powerhouse. And we laid a lot of the foundations for commercial success. Before that, I ran product at eBay UK. And I've worked for a wide range of different organizations, from large legacy organizations to product and tech first companies to startups, etc. So today I spend my time on some boards of some companies, and I'm also a partner at AKF Partners, heading up our efforts in Europe.
Great. And I'm Marty Abbott. Started my career as an officer in the U.S. Army, moved on after 5 years to be a software and electrical engineer at Motorola, then ran components of IT for Gateway when they were still around, specifically within the Asia Pacific region. Then went on to eBay for 6 years, the last 2 of which I was a CTO. That's how I met Tanya. Then became the COO for a struggling startup in New York, turned it around, sold it to AOL, and started AKF Partners with 2 friends 13 years ago and was lucky enough to hire Tanya recently.
So as I mentioned off mic, I'm most familiar with the AKF work through the Scale Cube. I think Simon Brown tipped me off to that many years ago now, and it's been super helpful throughout my career. I saw recently you have the AKF Availability Cube online, which I thought was very, very interesting. I love models as a sort of ex-consultant. I really like sort of models. Could you briefly introduce how the Availability Cube came about for me, please?
Yeah, the Availability Cube in many regards is just an extension of the Scale Cube, which we developed 13 years ago. But the premise for it and how it started was we noticed a number of clients are really struggling with the concept of microservices, specifically that they were chaining them together and very much disregarding the math regarding the availability impact of chained microservices. That's where service A calls service B, which may call service C, et cetera, each of which has a very specific, sometimes difficult to calculate, but nevertheless measurable availability component. And when they are chained, when service A calls service B, calls service C, the availability lowers because you get the multiplicative effect of failure. Think about electrical circuits, any component of which, when wired in series, should they break all components. Now, especially when applied to services, as compared to, say, a monolith, besides having these individual breakable components, any of which might cause a service to fail, you also have a number of other devices in between these services. And within cloud deployments, it's that much more difficult because you're not in control of the complete infrastructure. So if service A is designed to have 4 nines of availability, B and C are each designed to have 4 nines availability. And then you have networking components in between them, which may be built to 5 nines of availability, et cetera. It's very easy to see that those 4 nines on an individual basis, coupled with the 5 nines, very quickly reduces your availability to below 99.9%. And that's roughly 42 minutes of outage or customer impact a month, which most companies really don't want.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. Brett, to yourself, Tanya, as you were working with The Guardian, did you see microservices becoming a thing when you were there? Did you see this need to sort of break things apart to scale out and try to increase availability?
Without a shadow of a doubt. And funnily enough, I actually hired AKF to come and help us.
What a surprise.
Yeah, no, exactly. So Marty sort of rocked up and we had a sort of rapid learning on things like the scalability cube, etc. So it radically changed our approach on how we were building our services. Because I think at that time, we were very much focused really on a sort of UK audience. And this type of approach allowed us to suddenly really think about things in a much more ambitious, scalable way. So suddenly we could think about having a global audience, having our journalists being able to write content 24 hours a day, being able to expand in different countries, etc. So it really did lay the foundations for us to rapidly change our sort of engineering philosophy.
And I think back to my earlier point around the availability cube and microservices, we've always been huge proponents of microservices. The issue is in how they are deployed and architected. Microservices help engender significantly higher levels of organizational scalability, but if not applied properly, as in breadth versus depth being the chaining of microservices, if not deployed such that each pool of microservices faces a customer and they're never deep, that's where we may get organizational scale at the expense of the availability of the solution. So we like to flip that. We like to present microservices in breadth as components of the product architecture, but never in depth.
That's really interesting because I think there's a tendency with folks when they hear the word microservices is to decompose. We have this sort of notion of bounded context and so forth, but I definitely see people wanting to go to the chaining level. They say, I'm going to have the cart service that calls the payment service, these kind of things. I think from when we build systems at a code level, that's the kind of natural way we structure our code, the different layers, the different kind of chaining of things. Have you got any advice on how folks should design to minimize this long chain of services?
Sure. We often use the phrase services for breadth and libraries for depth. And the thing about libraries, everyone seems to be running away from them. But the great thing about them is they eliminate all of these extra hops, right? Calls through the operating system to the NIC, down through the network to another service, et cetera. And they still, especially if you use dynamically deployable, shared loadable libraries, they give you many of the same benefits of services in depth without the significant availability impact. All of these other devices standing between service A calling service B and still allow for independent deployment. And yet, for some reason, folks have just forgotten about them. They think services everywhere, services deep, services broad. And as a result, we get these huge service mesh networks that not only have low availability, but are incredibly difficult to troubleshoot because when one of these little fuses or services pops, if everything's connected, it's generally called the N squared problem. Everything fails. And when everything fails, you don't know where to start troubleshooting. We see, companies striving to get better organizational scale where an organization or team of 15 or fewer people own a service, all great, right? That allows us to have lower overhead, which results in higher velocity. But again, they start stacking them deep, services deep, that is. The number of our clients that do this runs into the hundreds at this point. And then they all wonder, well, why is it that my services deployment results in lower availability, even though I get higher velocity than it did before? And the answer is simple. It's the same thing we see again in electrical components. Think of Christmas tree lights, right? The old lights that if a single bulb burnt, the entire string went. And that's what happens when we change services together.
One thing I think you've hinted on there, Marty, which developers do like is the ownership thing, the whole, two pizza teams from Jeff Bezos and so forth. How does the ownership work with these libraries? Because I'm totally a fan of libraries. I've built my fair share of libraries in the Java world. But again, I was working on the monolith then. So I was owning the library as part of the general code base. If we're trying to split services up into different teams to improve velocity, how do the libraries play into this? Is it a centralized team or not, for example?
You can deploy a library in the same fashion that you deploy a service. As a matter of fact, often when we work with clients, we say, again, we're talking about services that run deep here or call chains, if you will. We often tell folks that a service is nothing more than a daemonized library with a RESTful interface. And if you can do that, And again, remember, things like DLLs, right? Or shared dynamically loadable libraries in both Unix and Linux. If you can do that, a team can own it, deploy it separately, and it just requires a restart of the service that was causing it, which, as a side note, often happens when you deploy a service anyways. The parent or calling service will often need to be restarted, even if it has circuit breakers, et cetera. So it's just good practice to eliminate all of these extra hops. But again, obviously focus on services decomposition, but do so from a broad perspective. You also brought up, if you don't mind, I think it's an interesting story, the notion of Jeff Bezos and two pizza teams. And there's a great story behind this. When Rick Dalzell was the CTO of Amazon, Amazon had hired him from Walmart long ago. He had a reading club within Amazon, and they read Fred Brooks's Mythical Man Month. And in there, Brooks references Conway's Law, which at the time was published in about 1969. The paper is called How Do Committees Invent? Brooks is the first one to call Conway's Law before it was a little red activity. And in there, he said, Brooks and Conway argue that teams should be small and own components, which is one of the corollaries of Conway's Law. And Jeff asked Rick, well, how large should teams be? Conway, by the way, in his paper says should be less than 8 people, but Brooks sort of increases that to the closest Dunbar number, which is between 12 and 15, tells us to Bezos. Bezos is like, this makes a lot of sense, but it's hard to follow. Why don't we say no team should be larger than that which 2 pizzas can feed?
That is an awesome story. I mean, I read the Mythical Man Munch in college and thoroughly enjoyed that one. And it's time I see the problems talked about in that book reinvented time and time again. I'd be curious actually to get both your opinions on why do we as an industry seem to repeat history? We don't always learn as much as I think we should. Don't know if you've got opinions on that.
Yeah, I just think people often just get their heads down and sort of forget to look up and realize what's sort of happening. So as an industry, as you quite rightly say, we're very passionate about having small empowered teams. Yet, particularly over the last 12 months, I've seen so many teams that have really got very bloated. And because the teams are really keen to have an expert on each thing in the room. So, for example, there'll be obviously the engineers, but then they'll have the product manager and they'll have a data analyst and they'll have a user experience researcher and then they'll have the designer. And then sometimes there's more than one of those people in the room. And suddenly a team that's meant to be very efficient at sort of 6, 7 people is suddenly becoming 10, 11, 12 people. And what's really frightening about the way some of these teams work is that they're being very much sort of siloed in their responsibilities. So they don't get out of their own swim lane. And I think that's particularly worrying with things like the data and the metrics, because nothing makes me sadder when you go and see a team and you ask them about their success metrics or the performance or particularly something they've implemented, what impact has it had? And then the team will look a bit blankly and go, but we don't have the data person here. And you're sort of going, come on, everybody should really be owning that and feeling sort of passionate about that. I suspect you've seen the same sort of thing, Marty.
Yeah, well put, Tanya. I liken this to 2 different areas. Hopefully they'll resonate with the listeners. One being diet and fitness. A lot of folks will attack only one side of it, right? They'll either diet or they'll exercise, but they don't do both. And as a result, the results are suboptimal. And the next analogy is the comparison of corporations with the military. And specifically, the military is always fighting the newest war with the newest weapons, but last war's tactics. And corporations do the same thing. It's new battle, new technology, old tactics. So we'll deploy microservices, but we'll do it in the same fashion that we used to think about libraries. That creates a problem. New weapons require new tactics. New technology requires new approaches.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think one of the things I've seen, and we see a lot actually now when we're working with companies, is that you have a lot of teams that are really trying to do the right things, but I often refer to them as sort of framework fanatics. And this is where these teams really beginning to make process rather than outcomes their North Star. Now, I have to confess, as consultants, as you've quite rightly said, we all love a good model, a good framework, etc. And I love a great framework to simplify a problem or identify a potential solution. But software development, product management, these things are not painting by numbers. Frameworks, rituals, processes are guides, not solutions. But too many teams today are really making their role about the execution of the process. rather than the impact of the work. And I've actually even come across teams, you come to a product squad. I came across one a few months ago and they defined their mission as being exemplary in agile. And they even had OKRs about how great they were doing agile, and the what and the how they were doing it had become the whole focus rather than the why, which I think everybody here would agree is the most important question.
Yes, the tail wagging the dog type situation. And I think it's often easier to focus on process than it is on outcomes. My experience, as the organization gets bigger, it's even harder because there's more bureaucracy introduced by its very nature as an organization scales. And I think that's something I've tried to fight against sometimes, is in reduce the bureaucracy. You mentioned OKRs there, for example. I think OKRs are, when used well, are a really good way to align teams on what are we actually trying to do and what are our levers. I don't know if you both got experience on how do we best communicate that to our teams. Have you got any advice on that?
I think that a senior technology executive's job is one of their primary jobs anyways, is to create a really good causal roadmap between what an engineer does every day and how it creates value for the company. And if OKRs are implemented properly, nested properly, and always reviewed thoroughly and updated frequently, it's a great mechanism to do that. The test there is, can an engineer look at an OKR tree and understand what he or she does every day and how it creates business value? And if we do that, I think we eliminate some of the issues similar to what Tanya brought up, specifically having approaches run perpendicular or orthogonal to the outcomes of the company. It's unclear how being agile, in the way that Tanya put it, really starts to create stakeholder wealth and value within a company.
Interesting. And something I want to sort of riff off that and pick up what you said, Tanya. I've definitely seen this where teams get bloated. What do you think is the way to resolve some of that? Is it to have, say, more of these specialists as consultants, even if they're full-time staff, but do they consult more to the individual teams?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you don't need everybody in the room all the time. And I think teams need to be clear on what is the sort of, who is the decision-making body, and what's that lovely phrase, is a camel is a horse designed by committee. Well, I think sometimes when you get teams that are too big, unfortunately, sort of common sense disappears and groupthink takes over. So I think teams really need to apply common sense. And put bluntly, if there are too many people in the room, you should kind of say, hold on, we need to get some of the people out of the room. Because I think the trouble is that often teams can see when things are going wrong, but actually we're all very nice and nobody wants to be the jerk to sort of say, actually, hop it, half of you. But I think sometimes teams really need to do that. For example, let me tell you a story of a team last year I came across. So this team was really passionate about discovery and getting user feedback, which obviously we all agree about. And every team had a dedicated user researcher. And the team had really landed on this idea that you would test everything in front of real users, and they built a testing lab in their building. So far, so good. You think that sounds all great. But over the periods of months, the process took over everything and nothing could be decided until it had been in front of some focus groups, and not just one focus group or two focus groups. You know, what's it with the design sprints, the sort of Jake Knapp process? They say you only have to put it in front of 5 people. Well, this group were putting it in front of sort of 8, 9, 10 focus groups. And because it's a team sport, discovery is a team sport, everybody had to attend every focus group. So the team lost confidence in making any decisions. The team became completely reliant on focus groups. And when they got the answer they didn't like, they just did more focus groups. And the engineers were utterly tearing their hair out because they had stopped writing any code because they're always in focus groups. The thing is, this team had moved their OKRs to be around how many focus groups they were actually conducting. So they were doing great on the OKRs, but actually common sense had gone through the door. And as I say, the engineers were just so frustrated. But what had started as a very sensible thing and a very sensible approach driven by good intentions had just got warped. So again, I think size of teams, it doesn't happen overnight where you have a high functioning team of 7 and then one day there's 15 people. What happens over a matter of weeks and months, suddenly that 7 becomes 8, then 9, 10, etc., etc.
It's that drift into failure mode in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, size of an organization responsible for getting something done is always highly correlated with bureaucracy. The larger the size of a group necessary to get something done, the higher the level of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is all non-value added overhead. So trying to get teams to be the right size, own outcomes consistent with their size is how we battle bureaucracy. And then measuring what matters. And specifically within engineering, what matters is how much time an engineer is spending doing the thing for which you pay him or her to do. And that's code. And if they're in meetings, if we don't measure that, if we don't know that an engineer spends 50% of his or her time in meetings, we don't know that they're only writing 50% of the time, which means that they cost twice as much to us, right? We're paying twice as much as we should for what matters, and management has to get involved and eliminate that bureaucracy, push ownership down, properly relate teams to architectural components, which are further directly related with business and product outcomes. And that's how we engender empowerment within teams.
Well said there. Well said. I wouldn't mind to pivot a little bit to look at some of the architectural principles now, if that's okay. So nice lead in there, I think. Microservices, were not necessarily a thing when your book was first published. I remember reading that many years ago. But a lot of the principles were there pre what we're now labeling as microservices. What's your thoughts of the evolution from the monolith to microservices? We're even seeing some folks now sort of going back towards the monolith. Have you got any sort of commentary around the journey we've been on?
This whiplash that you describe of teams rapidly adopting microservices and moving back to monoliths is seen time and time again with virtually every other technology evolution. It's not uncommon for folks to latch on to whatever the term or approach du jour is, go wholeheartedly, drop their hips and drive into the objective, and then realize, geez, we didn't plan enough. We didn't understand enough what we should be doing. We didn't architect well enough. And back to our earlier discussion, now we have these deep changes of microservices. And unfortunately, often they say, let's just go back to the prior state, when the best solution is, again, to optimize both sides of the equation, right? It's to both plan properly for availability, calculate the theoretical availability of a solution, broaden your microservices, in depth use libraries, your failure rates drop, the probability of failure drops. As a result, your availability increases, and you still get all of the other benefits of microservices.
I like it. I like it a lot. I was actually looking back through your book earlier on today, and one other thing I picked up on the designing things well is using mature technologies. And I guess that can apply to programming languages as well as databases and other things. We've got a fantastic array of technology at our disposal now. As a developer, I couldn't have, when I started my career, couldn't have dreamed what we've got now. What's your thoughts on how we should pick technologies appropriate for the task in hand?
Yeah, we have a wonderful article on the site about the bathtub effect and failure rates of different things, whether they be infrastructure or software, as it relates to their age. So think about a graph that has a bit of a bathtub, right? Think of it as a U where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is failure rates. Any new technology, whether it be infrastructure or software, has an incredibly high failure rate as we try to figure out how to make it work, how to reduce defects, et cetera. Ultimately, we bottom out, and that's a mature technology. But if you wait too long as infrastructure ages or as you take on additional debt and don't pay it down from a software perspective, those failure rates, again, increase on the far right side of the curve. And where we want our clients are in the basin of the bathtub, right? Solutions that have been tried by many other companies already. Most of the kinks have been worked out, but there's still some competitive advantage in adopting them. Then ride that until such time as the next bathtub comes around and swap before you have significantly higher failure rates. If you're designing systems predicated on high availability, either to meet a business need, a B2B business, or a consumer need, a B2C business, inherent to that value adoption by the consumer is availability. And we overlook it and we just think, hey, it's a new competitive advantage, and don't properly apply the calculus to understand what the failure rate and associated impact to our availability will be.
Very interesting. Have you got any experience with this one, Tanya? Say picking, two new technology and then regretting the choice at all?
I think we did that a couple of times at The Guardian, but it's really hard because when you have a fantastic, enthusiastic team, often the engineers want to try new technology. And I'm a big believer in making space for everybody to sort of learn and grow and test and all those sort of things. So I think there's the balance between allowing the team to try out new things. But as Marty quite rightly says, it's balancing the risk. So you don't want to be trying something really funky and new on something that's mission critical, sort of mission critical system for your service or product, etc. So I think there's a case of trying to give teams the room to experiment, but actually at the end of the day, you have to sort of take a kind of fairly cautious, pragmatic, and a very sort of a business approach on kind of where you do that and where you don't do that.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's something we talk at InfoQ a lot is about diffusion of innovation. Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, for example. And one thing we see is folks don't always recognize that different people's perspectives of it are going to be different. If you're a super hipster startup burning through VC money versus you're an enterprise, you've got money making software on COBOL that you've got to keep running, your risk tolerance, I guess, is very different depending on where you're coming from. I'm kind of curious, have you both got experiences of that where perhaps people haven't fully realized where they are in terms of what is risky to them? Is this new technology going to add value, or is it too risky to experiment with?
I think applying Tanya's approach of playing with things in non-mission critical areas of a product or even within a development or R&D environment helps teams better understand that and also get up to speed on the technology before it goes into a mission critical system. As a side note, the diffusion of innovation, do you happen to know where that came from prior to Geoffrey Moore?
Oh, I recently reread the book, actually. I don't. Go on, Martin, let me know.
Yeah, so the technology adoption lifecycle and diffusion of innovation theory comes from Rogers in 1962, but it had nothing to do with technology per se. It was the adoption of hybrid corn seed. So this model applies not only to technology, but virtually everything else that we do. Any new innovation, even though it's called the diffusion of innovation theory, which resulted in the technology adoption lifecycle and the technology adoption model, but it applies to the adoption of virtually anything that's innovative.
Intriguing. There's always lots to learn. When I was an academic, actually, my professor at the time always said to me, cross-pollinate. I was in, obviously, computer science, but they would say, go and chat to the biologists, go and chat to different people. You learn so much more by learning from other sources, I think, than where you're coming from.
Absolutely. And that's why we are so big as a firm and try to get our clients to adopt the notion of durable cross-functional teams where it's not just software developers who then pass something along to infrastructure people, but rather you have business people, product owners in an agile term, and software and infrastructure, DevOps, SREs, et cetera, all working on the same team to achieve a common outcome within that team.
Very nice. Very nice. You mentioned the SREs there in DevOps. One thing on the conversation I was keen to pick up on is observability, as we're now calling it, sort of monitoring, logging, and so forth. I'm guessing that's what we all know, really, that's super important. Have you got any sort of thoughts on how that relates to scalability and availability too?
Absolutely. There's a wonderful notion, not widely adopted, of test-driven development within engineering. We sort of took that and said, you also need to be thinking about, at the time of design, how it is you're going to monitor for the desired effect or business outcomes of this solution. And very often we say, within the agile notion of done, right, something being complete, it's when something actually achieves the business outcome, because that's where the expenses were predicated, not when we're done developing something, but rather, did it achieve the desired outcome? And if we start thinking that way on day zero, besides just the software that we write and the infrastructure upon which it's hosted, we would also be thinking about all of the associated monitoring capabilities to detect not only that it's not functioning as designed, I think that's a horrible term, but rather as expected. And expected means achieving the desired business outcome.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about performance testing. Now, I always find this quite tricky. Often it's a big bang thing at the end of a project. So we've designed a system. Hopefully we've thought about the cross-functional, non-functional requirements. But my experience frequently is things like performance testing are done at the end of the project. Any advice from either of you on how to shift that left or shift that forward a bit? Get sort of things like performance into the design and into the testing early on?
Yeah, I have two thoughts there. One is that the most mature organizations we know perform performance testing within their CI pipeline, such that commits ultimately trigger not only integration and unit tests, but also performance tests to understand the impact or degradation of performance of added functionality. That's point one. But point two, performance testing rarely has the payout we desire. because it's rare that we can reproduce the production environment in its entirety. If you were to do that, you've doubled your costs. But if your production environment is properly fault isolated back to the scale cube along the z-axis by customers, and let's say you have 10 of these, each of which serves 1/10 of your customers, with one very small exception that might be 30 basis points of your customers, and that's your canary environment. Now we can test live. And as long as we can easily roll back, we'll understand with real user traffic what the impact's going to be. One of the biggest issues with performance testing is when we release new functionality, we have an expectation as to user behavior. But very often what happens, and this is from our third book, users will use the new functionality in a way that we didn't understand. So our test is invalid to begin with.
You're nodding along there, Tanya. I've seen that too. I'm guessing you've seen that.
Oh, yeah. So I think that you always have to be very aware of how the users are behaving. And as Marty quite rightly says, sometimes they don't behave in a way that you're expecting. Or there's the other trap you fall into where you look at the data and you make an assumption. But I remember in the early days when I worked at eBay, there used to be this amazing chart that we had which showed the number of pages that users looked at. And this, as I say, is in the very early days of eBay. It was a bubble chart. And when you looked at all the other big websites at the time, the eBay sort of engagement of how many pages people looked at it was like this big Death Star bubble chart. And this sort of Death Star in the middle was eBay. And we really took it, at least for us in the UK, we looked and went, aren't our users engaged? Isn't that really great? And what have you. And we were really proud of this chart. And as we were trying to grow the business, we'd go out and sort of show it a lot to talk about how engaged our users were. However, as we sort of matured a bit and we started doing different types of testing and different ways to engage with our users, we realized that a fair proportion of all those pages people were checking out was because they were finding discoverability really hard on the website. So they couldn't actually find what they were looking for. So we had this metric that we initially thought was a really fantastic thing. We were very proud of it. And then actually when we started peeling away the onion, we realized that a fair chunk of it was actually due to sort of user confusion or not being able to do what you wanted to do. So not surprisingly, discoverability and findability became a sort of big priority then for the months ahead once we discovered that.
That is such a great story about making sure you're measuring the right things. As a result of that, we moved away from how many things or items a customer views to the ratio of searches to an add to cart or purchase, because that's really what's important.
We're coming to the end of our time now, and so are there any additional topics you were keen to cover?
In the middle of our sort of coronavirus craziness, there are a lot of websites at the moment that are really struggling with scalability, availability, etc. And I thought it'd be really interesting, Marty, maybe if you had a few words of sort of, if you're the CTO or engineering head of one of those companies, from a leadership perspective, how do you work through these crazy times? I see Zoom today has published something about what they've been doing, but obviously you're also one of the people who've lived through this sort of crazy hypergrowth and then having to deal with the consequences of it.
I don't know how a company can properly identify black swan events like COVID, but I do know that there are companies that have absolutely risen to the occasion, and you both mentioned Zoom. Those folks should be applauded because all of a sudden overnight, I have no direct insight into their traffic numbers or interaction numbers, but overnight everyone's working from home and they're using solutions like Zoom to do this. Those folks emerge from this thing as a shining star in terms of the scale and availability of their solution as compared to a number of old brick and mortar companies that didn't properly invest in their commerce solutions online that are failing because they're all seeing Black Friday-like numbers. And these things, while they take time to fix, they're almost always easy to fix. It's just technology. As long as it's architected properly using building blocks or scale bricks, as we call them, it's easy, especially with elastic compute, to be able to scale these things nearly on demand and avoid black swan events. So again, as with any significant issue like we're facing today, there are always the heroes like Zoom. And unfortunately, the landscape's always littered with folks who weren't prepared for the black swan.
I chatted to some folks the other day and they were talking about running what we call game days, effectively sort of creating disaster scenarios, not real ones, but as in creating these scenarios, running them and see how people behave. Is that something either of you've done in the past?
Absolutely. We always tell our clients that you need to practice what we call the DID approach. The first being the design of a solution, which is theoretically or at least intellectually high cost. But in terms of actual software, there's not a lot to do. And you need to get that out of the way before these events such that you would understand how to deploy. So high cost intellectually, but the absolute cost is low. And then the implementation of it, which is the writing of software, lower intellectual cost, but higher activity, operating margin impact, you're paying engineers. And then finally, you don't actually have to deploy the last D until you need it, especially in the cloud infrastructure as a service enabled world. And therefore, you don't have to impact your cost of goods sold. You'll have it developed and ready. And then it's just elastic expansion when you need it.
Interesting. Have you seen anything like that, Tanya? I've heard of it more recently, but folks sort of running these disaster trainings, for example. And like Marty said, you've got to have some capabilities already there, but it's often interesting from the social side. How do folks react to disaster?
We've probably never planned anything quite the level of disaster that we're seeing today. We've never planned for a sort of COVID-19 type event, but we have done those sort of disaster recovery days where something's not working or what have you. The one that, funnily enough, the teams often neglect is particularly when you have a lot of legacy systems, there's that one engineer who is the only one left in the building who knows something. So if you're ever doing the sort of planning of around sort of disaster scenario planning, you should plan that that engineer is suddenly unavailable, because that's often a really big single point of failure that many teams have.
I like that a lot. I don't know if either of you read the Unicorn Project and the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim, but he talks a lot about this kind of stuff. And like I've recently read Unicorn Project, and it's very much the people can be as big a bottleneck as the technology. So I like it a lot. Well, super. Thanks both for your time today. I really enjoyed chatting. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Daniel.